Welcome to the very first Forums program discussion. The Forums program is a subcomponent to our Cyber Professional Leadership Development Program. We also refer to it as the CPD. So we had pitched it to the Chief of Staff along with Sergeant Major Harris. They like the framework, the model that we've established. This is, of course, a pilot right now with this program and this discussion being the very first thing. We've given you surveys. By all means, fill out the surveys with your input. We will use that input in order to assess and develop this even further. Also gave you the business cards with the actual URL to the CPD site. It's on SharePoint, it's on Nipper, and it is available for you to go to. The model is explained there, and you can follow along from left to right along the tabs on the top, or you can go along the quick links from top to bottom. You can go through the actual professional development model as we see it. Keep in mind, there's things that we do in the command right now, and they just haven't been put into a framework. That's what the CPD is kind of doing. So we have the innovation series, and Major Klein is working with the CG on that. We're trying to integrate that into the Forums program as well and establish it as a battle rhythm event. This is, right now, as it stands, resourced as a battle rhythm event. So every third Thursday of the month, we will have a 1-hour session where we will open up for discussion on various topics. And those topics will actually be driven by the community. So with this one, we felt it was probably appropriate to start from the beginning. So that's why we've asked Dr. Kaplan to present a discussion. He will moderate the discussion, and we hope to have some dialogue here. It's not really meant to be me or him talking to people. It's for us to sit down, take an hour, eat some food, and hey, you know what? What's the crazy thing about the symbology of the unit patch, or why is it not a slash between U.S. Army Cyber Command and 2nd Army? So, administrative notes, this is an unclassified brief. With that said, please ensure that you don't have any of your badges. Put those away, and there's no other classified information being displayed. This discussion is being recorded, and like I said before, this recording will be presented. We have a YouTube channel that we've stood up. Once we vet the video, we will go ahead and publish it onto the YouTube channel for people to access. So
which cameras?
You'll be able to go to the URL. Don't worry about the cameras. Other than that, if you need to take a break at any time, you need to use the latrine. Entrance and exit is located right there. If in case of a fire, of course, we will follow the fire procedures and exit the building accordingly to our designated locations. At this point in time, are there any questions? All right. With that said, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Kaplan. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming today to hear my overview presentation on the establishment of U.S. Army Cyber Command. This presentation will discuss some key events leading to the establishment of U.S. Army Cyber Command in October 2010, and we'll explain how and why the ARCYBER Table of Distribution Allowances, the TDA, was put together, how and why the ARCYBER headquarters was dispersed in the National Capital Region, the NCR, the relationship between Army Cyber and 2nd Army, and various aspects of Army Cyber shoulder sleeve insignia, distinctive unit insignia, and command colors. Next slide, please. In the 1980s and 1990s, U.S. Army's major commands and theater combatant commands independently resourced their own information system requirements. The decentralization led to a proliferation of non-standardized command control communication and computer systems and an unacceptable level of incompatibility among Army information systems, equipment, and support networks. In August 2002, the Army established the Network Enterprise Technology Command, NETCOM, 9th Army Signal Command, as the single authority to operate, manage, and defend the Army's enterprise-level infrastructure. In response to the increasing complexity and growth of security threats to the Army's portion of the World Wide Web, known as the Land War Net. NETCOM was a direct reporting unit to the Army CIO G6, and later, in 2006, renamed NETCOM 9th Signal Command Army. Next slide, please. In 2004, the Army recognized the critical collaboration required between computer network defenders and providers to secure Army networks and combined the NETCOM Army Global Network Operations Security Center, AGNOSC, and the Intelligence and Security Command's First Information Operations Command Army Computer Emergency Response Team, ACERT, into the ACERT AGNOSC Theater Operations Center, or A2TOC, at Fort Belvoir, Virginia. There also were 6 regional certs worldwide that supported the A2 TOC. Next slide, please. By September 2006, the Army recognized that computer network operations were evolving into the larger mission set of cyberspace operations and directed the First IO Command to integrate, coordinate, and synchronize Army computer operations. There remained, however, a requirement for senior operational leadership to oversee this mission. To address this requirement, in January 2008, the Army designated commanding generals for NETCOM 9th Signal Command and INSCOM as deputies for network operations and network warfare, respectively, under the commanding general of Army Space and Missile Defense Command, Army Forces Strategic Command, SMDC ARCYBER. SMDC ARCYBER was the Army Service Component Command to U.S. Strategic Command. This new structure put an operational lieutenant general in charge of Army computer network operations and provided the capabilities required across the spectrum of computer network operations. In July 2008, the Army activated its first provisional network warfare battalion under INSCOM. That's the Intelligence and Security Command. Next slide, please. Now, in late May 2009, as Army network operations, network warfare, and IO personnel were deployed worldwide supporting joint and Army commanders, the Army staff established the Army Cyberspace Task Force under the G357 to integrate efforts across the Army staff among the G2, the G4, and the CIO G6 to provide policy oversight and guidance for Army cyberspace and cyberspace operations. Brigadier General Stephen Smith from the CIO G6 led the task force. Next slide, please. Shortly after the task force organized, it quickly reoriented its focus when a June 2009 Secretary of Defense memorandum directed each of the services to identify a component to support the establishment of U.S. Cyber Command by October 2010. Next slide, please. Now, the task force received guidance to look at what would make the most efficient use of the Army's existing capabilities and determining whether NETCOM, INSCOM, an elevated First IO, SMDC ARCYBER, or a new hybrid command should be established as the headquarters for cyberspace operations. Lieutenant General James Thurman, the G3, directed the task force not to harm any mission sets, in other words, don't break anything, not to increase the Army's end strength, and he wanted all of this done in about 90 days. Next slide, please. Well, in the meantime, the Army designated SMDC ARCYBER as the U.S. Army Forces Cyber Command, ARCYBER, as the interim Army Service Component Support, which subsequently reached initial operational capability on October 1st, 2009. Next slide, please. Now, the task force ultimately recommended standing up a new hybrid command under a 3-star general rather than selecting NETCOM, INSCOM, or SMDC ARCYBER to be the headquarters for Army cyberspace operations. General Peter Corelli, the Vice Chief of Staff, and Dr. Joseph Westfall, the Undersecretary of the Army, approved the decision on December 22nd, 2009, which had become Decision Point 141 of the Army Campaign Plan that previous August. Next slide, please. General George W. Casey, the Army Chief of Staff, approved the decision on February 1st, 2010, and designated the establishment of a new separate command with operations centered at Fort Belvoir, composed of an initial complement of 309 personnel. He also directed it to temporarily include a proponent function, normally a TRADOC responsibility, but since he did not believe TRADOC could devote the attention and resources necessary to support the new command, he gave that mission set over to the new Army Cyber Command. The task force had never considered that, so that threw them for a little bit of a loop on the numbers that they were projecting. Army Secretary John McHugh subsequently approved the decision as well. Next slide, please. Headquarters of the Army, Department of the Army Execute Order number 155-10, released May 11, 2010, directed ARCYBER's establishment as a separate command, which was to achieve initial operational capability by June 29th and full operational capability October 1st, 2010. It was to establish the Army Cyberspace Operations Integration Center, a COIC, at Fort Belvoir no later than the third quarter of FY10. It was to assume operational control of NETCOM 9th Signal Command, which was to be assigned to ARCYBER upon publication of a general order establishing the new command. It was to assume operational control of INSCOM for cyberspace operations and operational control of several First IO command elements. In addition to naming SMDC RSTRAT as the interim ARCYBER, the execute order directed the G2 to develop a plan for an Army Cyber Brigade subordinate to INSCOM to conduct signals intelligence, computer network operations, and dynamic cyber defense in support of ARCYBER directed operations. The 744th Military Intelligence Battalion, formerly the Army Network Warfare Battalion, currently perform the mission. The Army later approved the establishment of an Army Cyber Brigade in December 2010 and designated the 780th MI Brigade with an effective date of 1 October 2011 to fulfill the 744th MI Battalion's mission. The execute order also directed the U.S. Army Training and Doctrine Command TRADOC to transition Army Computer Network Operations Proponent responsibilities to ARCYBER and assist the new command in establishing the Army Cyber Proponent. The new ARCYBER also was to be established in the National Capital Region. Next slide, please. When General Casey approved the plan for the new command, it included having NETCOM assigned to it. Although Lieutenant General Jeffrey Sorensen, the CIO G6, supported General Casey's decision, his designated successor, Major General Susan Lawrence, then the current NETCOM commander, subsequently raised concerns in the summer of 2010 about the legality of delegating certain legal authorities pertaining to the defense of Army networks, which were the responsibility of Army Secretary John McHugh, to the new Cyber Command. Up until this point, the lawyers had not been heavily involved in the staffing process to establish the new command. Now the lawyers on the Army staff and Secretariat developed different views on the issue, which began to jeopardize plans to assign NETCOM to the new Cyber Command. Next slide, please. In the meantime, Lieutenant General Richard Zahner, the G2, tried to help find a home for the new Army Cyber Command. He offered to provide ample space for the new command in the INSCOM headquarters at the Nolan building at Fort Belvoir. He planned to reorganize INSCOM in an MI rebalance and free up hundreds of spaces in the Nolan building, and he offered that space to the Cyber Force Task Force for the new command. However, after Major General Mary Legier, the INSCOM commander, and his designated successor to be the G2 conferred with him, the reorganization never went through, which left the task force without a backup plan to station the new command. General Zahner then offered to house the command in a new building at Fort Meade, Maryland, Building 2600A, 2600 Alpha, which was then being constructed to accommodate the 902nd Military Intelligence Group after a fire destroyed that unit's previous facility. This would have put the new command close to U.S. Cyber Command, which is what General Keith B. Alexander, the Cybercom commander, wanted. Next slide, please. Well, one of the task force's recommendations was to have a combat arms officer, a war fighter, if you will, who understood how to integrate functions, head the new command, rather than a signal officer or a military intelligence officer. On June 14, 2010, the Army announced the selection of Major General Rhett A. Hernandez, Assistant Deputy Chief of Staff G357, and he was a field artilleryman, to be the new ARCYBER commander. Next slide, please. While plans were going forward for the new command, Lieutenant General Thurman directed the Army Cyberspace Task Force, who were working on the initial table of distribution and allowances, to keep it lean and mean, since the Army could not increase its end strength, and the positions for the new command had to come out of hide from other organizations. When General Thurman saw the task force's proposed TDA, the first chop they had on doing a TDA, he had them arbitrarily cut it by 50%. Too big. Got to keep it lean. Part of this rationale was based on the belief that NETCOM would be assigned to the new command, and there would be unnecessary redundancy in building a robust ARCYBER TDA, particularly for the support staff. Meanwhile, SMDC RSTRAT subsequently took over the TDA work and developed a concept plan for 561 positions that was later approved. Next slide. On September 13th, the Army published Fragmentation Order 1 to XORD 155-10, which directed the split-based establishment of the new command at Fort Belvoir and Fort Meade, Maryland. Now the Army's initial intent was to locate the entire command at Fort Meade as soon as possible. INSCOM was to provide space for the Army Cyber Commanding General and some headquarters staff personnel and the ARCYBER in the Nolan building at Fort Belvoir, and the remaining headquarters staff elements and the proponent were to be located at Building 8543 at Fort Meade. The fragmentation order directed the staff to be prepared to relocate to Building 2600 Alpha at Fort Meade to consolidate operations by a target date of July 2011, provided the facility met a site survey. Next slide, please. The Army was the last of the services to stand up a cyber organization to support U.S. Cyber Command. The Air Force called their organization 24th Air Force, and the Navy called theirs 10th Fleet. The Army planned to have a numbered Army for theirs. The U.S. Army Center of Military History, in charge of organizational history in the Army, recommended several inactive armies for consideration, including the 2nd U.S. Army, which General Hernandez favored. However, in late September, a few days before the new command was to be stood up, Lieutenant General Daniel Bulger, the new G3, requested that the new Cyber Command use 2nd Army for its affiliation and its title. But the Center of Military History non-concurred, pointing out that the Army changed its naming conventions for field armies back in 2005, and they were no longer used in official titles, such as U.S. Army North and U.S. Army South. But the new command could be assigned the lineage and honors of the inactive 2nd U.S. Army. The Center of Military History also agreed to grant an exception to policy to have a field army associated with a TDA unit. Next slide, please. Well, on October 1st, 2010, the Army published General Orders number 2010-26, designating the new 3-star command as U.S. Army Cyber Command, an operational level Army force reporting directly to Headquarters Department of the Army and receiving the lineage and honors of the former 2nd Army. 2nd Army was never authorized to be part of the official title. The command operated with an authorized complement of 561 personnel who were assigned at Fort Belvoir and Fort Meade pending a final stationing decision. The total command strength included approximately 21,000 soldiers, Department of the Army civilians, and contractors located worldwide, with NETCOM and INSCOM units supporting the new command but not assigned to it. The command brought an unprecedented unity of effort and synchronization of all Army forces operating within the cyber domain, but there remained challenges. Without having NETCOM assigned to it, its TDA was inadequate. It had no permanent home, and it had no budget. Next slide, please. Well, as ARCYBER worked to staff its authorized billets, the command rapidly began to outgrow its assigned facilities. For example, on February 9th, 2011, Major General Hernandez notified the Fort Meade installation commander that ARCYBER's assigned space in Building 8543 was filled to 157% of capacity, and the command needed additional space. As the command found some additional near-term space in the areas of Fort Meade and Fort Belvoir, the Army staff began developing requirements for a new ARCYBER headquarters facility after determining that Building 2600 Alpha at Fort Meade failed to meet the command's requirements. In addition to not having enough space requirements or power requirements or maybe security requirements, the building was also supposed to go to the 902nd. It would have taken the Army staff going back to Congress to repurpose the building, and the Army staff was reluctant to do that. So there were several reasons, other than the fact that the building itself may not have been an exact fit, for that building not working out. The Army staff examined potential stationing options for the command, including stationing at Fort Meade with a new military construction project, or stationing at Fort Gordon, Georgia, in existing facilities near the National Security Agency, or a new MILCON project down there as well, military construction, in proximity to the National Security Agency. The Army staff subsequently selected Fort Gordon in December 2013 for the future ARCYBER headquarters. Next slide, please. Well, Lieutenant General Edward C. Cardone took over as the ARCYBER commander on September 3rd, 2013, just prior to the announcement of the stationing decision, and he continued to pursue a new Army general orders that would improve the command and control arrangements with NETCOM. Next slide, please. Well, that occurred on March 6, 2014, when the Army revised the command and control relationship between ARCYBER and NETCOM with the release of General Orders 214-2 that reactivated a new Second Army as a direct reporting unit to the CIO G6 and dual-hatted the ARCYBER Commanding General as the Second Army Commanding General. NETCOM, which had been a direct reporting unit to the CIO G6, now reported to Second Army, and the NETCOM Commanding General also became the Second Army Deputy Commanding General. Now at this point, Second Army took back its lineage and honors from Army Cyber, and there were no longer any direct ties with Army Cyber Command. It also had no assigned staff, and the Army Cyber staff became the de facto Second Army staff. Just General Cardone and the Commanding General of NETCOM, Major General Morrison, they were assigned to Second Army. But there were no other people assigned to Second Army. But so the Army Cyber Command staff, as I said, we've been acting in a capacity as the de facto Second Army staff. Army Secretary McHugh granted an exception to policy for reactivating Second Army against the non-concurrence of the Army Center of Military History, since armies are not TDA organizations. So this ends the first part of my presentation. I'm going to just briefly go into some of the aspects, next slide please, of Army Cyber Command shoulder sleeve insignia, distinctive unit insignia and colors, and then we'll open up the floor to discussion.
Dr. Kaplan, can we talk about some of the history then leading up there? Because I heard some snickers and some chuckles about that. So, I mean, what are does anybody have anything they want to talk about, or make comment about what the history up to now?
Give me another 2 minutes. We'll finish this and we'll go back to that. Okay? So the Army Cyber shoulder sleeve insignia on the left was designated and approved in the summer of 2010 prior to the stand-up of the command. It should not be confused with the logo on the right. And in essence, if you're not familiar with it, the green alludes to ARCYBER as a land-based organization. The Pentagon's inner-shaped border suggests containment of threats against cyberspace infrastructure. The flowing grid denotes shifting electronic energy of cyberspace. The globe divided from light to dark signifies the 24/7 electronic reach of ARCYBER. And the three spears symbolize computer network capabilities of attack, defense, and exploit. The lightning bolt illustrates the swift ability to strike anywhere. Next slide, please. The ARCYBER distinctive unit insignia on the left was approved in 2011, and after ARCYBER had an affiliation with Second Army. It drew in part on design features from the Second Army's distinctive unit insignia on the right, such as the red and white fleur-de-lis, red and white being colors of the Field Army. General Hernandez wanted to use the slogan "second to none" for the distinctive unit insignia, but that was already taken by the 2nd Infantry Division. So the Army Institute of Heraldry, which approves insignia, allowed ARCYBER to use the Latin translation of second to none, secundum ad nominem. It should also be noted that the fleur-de-lis indicated the command's lineage to Second Army, inheriting the unit's campaign credit in Lorraine, France during World War I. Next slide, please. We're getting close to the end here. The ARCYBER colors changed due to the March 2014 General Orders, which reactivated Second Army. In the summer of 2010, the Institute of Heraldry approved blue colors, as seen on the left for ARCYBER. Once the October 1st, 2010 General Orders that established ARCYBER were issued, then the colors changed to red and white, symbolizing Second Army's lineage and honors being assigned to Army Cyber. The March 2014 General Orders, which reactivated Second Army and took away its lineage and honors from ARCYBER, led to a return to the original blue colors. Next slide, please. So, before concluding this part of the presentation, I just want to point out that there has been a great deal of confusion in ARCYBER over the years about the usage of the term Second Army in some of our signage and briefings. And there's a variety of incorrect usage here, if you'll take a look at some of the signs and briefings depicted on this slide. When the command was established in October 2010, the Center of Military History was very clear that ARCYBER would have a lineage and honors, but not the title Second Army in its official title. Despite that, ARCYBER did use a variety of incorrect nomenclature on its signs and stationery, which caused confusion, until Lieutenant General Cardone became the commanding general in September 2010 and brought an end to the practice. He also brought an end to the practice of using the slogan "second to none" in the command, which was the slogan of the 2nd Infantry Division, his former command. So if you take a look up on the right there, you'll see that Second Army existed between 1918 and 1957. They changed their name officially from 57 to 2014 to Second U.S. Army, and then came back to Second Army. And if you take a look at some of that signage, the one on the lower right that we used to have on our website says U.S. Second Army. That never even existed. There was never any nomenclature that was ever called that. So in my concluding remarks, so we can get to the discussion, is overall I want you to keep in mind that some of the original plans and expectations for standing up Army's cyber did not occur, which affected its TDA and its stationing. The Army's processes and procedures were never designed to stand up a 3-star command in 8 months. That normally takes years. A stationing decision alone takes anywhere from 18 months to 3 years. So the necessity to stand up the command by 1 October 2010 to support U.S. Cyber Command was non-negotiable, and the Army took unavoidable risk in standing up the command without a proper TDA or stationing decision. And at this point, now let's have some discussion.
All of those signs at Fort Meade, what you see up there, and maybe you'll know the answer to this, I don't know, is there a plan to go back and correct all that, or isn't that cost effective now?
Or are they
We
still
got
up?
more money.
Yeah, it is still up, yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's still there.
Yeah,
I
we
mean,
need to change it. We're wealthy.
wow.
Well, I don't have an answer for that. The piece that I think was confusing, not so much now, but after the command was stood up, and before I got here as the historian in late November 2011, is there was no quality control on, well, what should we do on the terminology on the science and stationary?
Yeah.
And so that caused some confusion. And another piece of confusion has to do with the distinctive unit insignia of the command being linked so strongly with the Second Army. That became invalid in March 2014 when Second Army took back its lineage and honors. So if you were to go to the website and read about how Army Cyber has this distinctive unit insignia because Army Cyber has the lineage and honors of Second Army, it doesn't. It did,
We're a fraud.
but not anymore. So that's confusing to some people.
I have a very simple question. It's about the ampersand that's not accepted when you go U.S. Army Cyber ampersand Second Army, right?
That's correct.
That symbol doesn't match with putting it in Microsoft. It just won't go in titles. And so I find it very amusing that was put out as a solution for the naming, but every time you try and store something labeled that, it won't allow you. So is there any way through the correct process that we could use a slash or
No.
just, it has to be an ampersand?
Well, frankly, even though if the audience seeing this on YouTube, I'm probably going to think this is way too far into the weeds, but the proper terminology today is you write out U.S. Army Cyber Command and Second Army. When we abbreviate ARCYBER, then we can use the ampersand with a 2A.
Yeah.
You don't use the ampersand other than the abbreviated version.
Yeah, the reason we do it that way, since that came up just as I was getting here, after I was hired in spring of 2014, and the issue came up with Headquarters Department of the Army, basically, in a negotiated process, or discussion, I guess, with the Office of General Counsel, the issue was, if you say it's U.S. Army Cyber Command / Second Army, the implication is that it's all one organization, and the General Counsel's office objected, as Larry was involved in these discussions. So the idea was you had to have some way of describing two separate organizations. So the agreement was we would always use and not slash. There would always be something that would indicate there are two separate organizations.
However, I heard you say that the staff for both headquarters are one.
Yes.
So, okay.
So
Thank
one of the so after the general order, which you didn't mention, which is Department of the Army General Order 2014 TAC 2, which created or essentially did away with the original general order in 2010 TAC 26, which stood up Army Cyber Command officially by order of the Secretary of the Army. Part of the process was, there was an execute order, 103 TAC 14 out of HQDA. One of the tasks was to create a TDA, a separate organization for Second Army, to come up with a concept of what Second Army would look like. That's never been done and never will be done.
So in regards to the TDA, I've noticed that a lot of the green suiters, the enlisted side, are working a lot of outside of their roles. And what I mean by that is I am a 25 Bravo, so by trade and by how I was trained up through my schooling, I should be working help desk, G6, networking, computers, and stuff like that. But I'm seeing so many of the Signal MOSs working so far out of their skill. Why was our slots built into this TDA when, you know, like for me being the readiness guy, was there like a reasoning for picking all these Signal MOSs to do the readiness, the tasking officials, you know, to do a lot of the non-technical skills that in this command?
Well, I can't answer that specifically. I can answer it partially and partial generally. One of the officers who worked on the TDA, the original TDA, when I interviewed him, if you could go back and do something over again, what would you do? And he said, well, we have way too many technical slots and we didn't build enough for other things. And so what you're seeing is you're using an existing TDA and find out when you get here it's not right size for what you want,
Yeah.
and now you're reorienting people. And I think that's part of what addresses your concern.
And so one of the issues we've had to deal with is that the original, as you point out, the original TDA was never actually filled out the way it was intended, envisioned. And what happened was NETCOM was supposed to, people who were on the roles of NETCOM in the National Capital Region were supposed to have shifted over, and much of that TDA would have come from what formerly were NETCOM billets. That remained up until recently. We had NETCOM, we've just recently reorganized all that. Most of the people who did filled our cyber functions were actually still assigned on NETCOM TDA roles. They were assigned to NETCOM, not Army Cyber proper.
Well, and with that, I was working on the NETCOM side of the house. So when all the orders came out in 2013, we were confused also with RCG being the deputy commander. Okay, we're trying to coordinate with the ARCYBER staff, who doesn't have a process or procedure already created. Well, we're still doing operations. So how do we get orders and the authorities to conduct operations under ARCYBER? So we started writing our own orders, pushing it to ARCYBER to be published to come back down to us. So it's kind of weird how some of those roles, and like you were talking about, Sergeant Wenzel, some of us in NETCOM were giving products to different staff sections because they didn't have any and they don't have the personnel in place to do things. So we were doing kind of left seat, right seat ride from afar where we could, because it was making our lives easier at NETCOM.
So what we agreed in the summer of 2014 was that all orders would be issued with both the Army Cyber Command and Second Army designation. That way, any authority that either organization had would be brought to bear, and it would be a combination so that it would be issued in the name of both. And that's, to this day, that's what we do. One question, so what does it mean to say lineage and honors? What exactly does that
So
mean?
what that really translates to is we're entitled, when we had the lineage and honors, our cyber had the lineage and honors of Second Army, we were entitled to one campaign streamer, one campaign credit. So that would mean if the flag was up here, it would have one streamer. And that what General Hernandez usually evoked was a historic tie back to war-fighting soldiers of Second Army when they were organized in World War I. So here you have this brand spanking new organization of 2010, and when General Hernandez's thinking was, is by picking Second Army, when we wanted to evoke some type of historical ties with the Army, that we had the lineage and honors, and that we could evoke certain people and certain contributions and this, that, and the other.
It helps build esprit de corps when you have a history. And you can look back and brings commonality to the organization.
Okay.
And so it helped just give people a better foundation of their Army roots. And I think it was an unintended consequence when the March 2014 general orders came out and activated a brand new Second Army, a completely different unit identification code from the previous ones, that when Second Army took back its lineage and honors, that just means ARCYBER is a brand new place with no history prior to 2010. There's no links they can go back to and evoke for Veterans Day or Memorial Day or these type of events where you might want to reflect on these things.
Well, we have a history. You showed the history back to, what was it, 2008?
Well, that's the kind of the history of who's doing the functions. But Army
Right.
Cyber's establishment, we're in the Army Cyber patch. You're a brand new organization.
Couldn't that help esprit de corps, just being part of that new organization? You know, why? Like, what was the purpose of associating it or giving it lineage and honors versus now we don't have it? Correct? We don't have the lineage and honors
Well,
anymore.
in my opinion, I think that was. I think people kind of took their eye off lost the bubble here a little bit on wanting to do the new general orders. If the concept was to have Second Army used in the title,
Mhm.
and because Center Military History wouldn't let you do that because of the nomenclature guidelines, then one way to do that was get Second Army reactivated as a real army.
Yeah.
But when you reactivate it and you don't kludge it together with Army Cyber, that's the unintended consequences. So that was the thinking in terms of what General Hernandez had desired.
Yeah.
He and his staff wanted to be able to use the terminology that we had on those signs and stationery. And the people in the Army staff who were working on the new general orders, they could have picked a different name for what is today's Second Army. We did propose several other names. And if they had picked another name for that direct reporting unit entity, then we would have kept the lineage and honors of Second Army. It still would have been inactive. But that's
then-
the lineage and honors
So
piece.
then my quick question based off of that is, what was the purpose of assigning it? Why couldn't it just be Army Cyber Command? Like, what was the purpose of having the Second Army aspect?
Well, it
tied
has
into
to
it?
do with being comparable to the other services. The 10th Fleet for the Navy,
Mhm.
24th Air Force for the Air Force.
So,
Well,
so I can
alignment
explain-
No, there's more to it.
Yeah.
Well, I can explain the 10th Fleet, that's where I came from, obviously.
Okay.
You know
But
where I come from.
it's the difference between joint and service,
Mm.
and aligning forces under them, and who gets to pick their bones.
So
So
for Fleet Cyber Command, as the former SJA, the Fleet Cyber Command was essentially created, Navy's a little bit different. We use echelons, echelon 2, echelon 1, echelon 2, echelon 3. So Fleet Cyber Command is an echelon 2 command, which means it essentially reports to the Chief of Naval Operations. And it's essentially the administrative side of the house. Fleet Cyber Command, or 10th Fleet rather, excuse me, was created again from a World War II fleet that was decommissioned. It was recommissioned as a new operational arm for Fleet Cyber Command, but it's subordinate to Fleet Cyber Command. In other words, Fleet Cyber Command is an echelon 2. 10th Fleet is an echelon 3 that reports to, but is on par with the other operational fleets, the 2nd, the 3rd, the 4th, the 5th, and the 6th and the 7th. That was why it was done that way. It's the operational arm subordinate to Fleet Cyber Command. So in other words, under that construct, Second Army would be subordinate to Army Cyber Command and would be the operational component. But that's not how things are done in the Army side.
yeah.
But isn't there authorities
And-
associated with the establishment of
Yes.
Second Army, though,
Yes.
as a DRU to CIOG6?
Yes, so the reason that was done was, as Mr. Kaplan mentioned, formerly NETCOM was DRU to CIOG6. The idea was that it was necessary, at least in the opinion of CIOG6 and the General Counsel's office, was that you had to retain service forces to do the service functions, the secretarial functions. So instead of assigning those functions to the combatant command, the idea was that you would retain those as a service function, and then they needed some organization that would be DRU to the CIOG6 for that. And that would be Second Army. My response would be, you could have Army Cyber do the same thing.
That was
There
my
was never a
question.
need for Second Army, but that wasn't the prevailing view, at least at the time, in Headquarters Department of the Army. The view was that you needed a separate organization completely, which again, I would argue is not correct. And the other services, the other services don't take that view.
Yeah.
But the Army, all ASCCs, like our North, our North, have a numbered Army. And it's to keep that separation of assigned forces. Because if you assign the forces to Army Cyber, this is where I was trying, if you assign Army forces to Army Cyber, Cybercom, a joint, now has auspices to pull those forces apart and utilize them. If you tuck them under Army, the Army service maintains control. Plus, from the IO world, the IO mission is an Army mission. To assign that mission to Army Cyber, which is a joint, soon to become ASCC, doesn't match, because you'll assign assets to a joint for an Army mission. I may have it legally incorrect, but that's how they taught me in school.
The way I would respond to that is that if you read AR 10-87, Army Regulation 10-87, which covers all organizations, major organizations in the Army, what it points out is, even for Army Service Component Commands, the Secretary acknowledges that the Secretary of the Army acknowledges that the Secretary of Defense has assigned them to a combatant command.
Yeah.
The Secretary of the Army also retains, or still has, the ability to task them with service functions, man, train, equip functions under Title 10 U.S. Code Section 3013B, which is the Secretary of the Army's requirements to man, train, equip, and it goes through a laundry list of things that have to be done. So the argument would be that even as an Army Service Component Command, should our higher headquarters become a full functional combatant command, that Army's Cyber Command would retain all those service functions just like every other Army Service Component Command. In other words, they respond to the joint community, but they also have a service function and are responsible to the Secretary of the Army. And that's literally what each and every one of those organizations, that's how they're described in Army Regulation 10-87. In other words, there's a recognition that there's a joint component and there's also a service component, the man, train, equip function. And that's especially true for the Army Service Component Commands, because they essentially are the Army's representative to combatant commands to take care of those man, train, equip functions.
I have a question. I'm interested in how you're maintaining the history for the command. I know you interview. Have you thought about using a StoryCorps sort of approach? And do you review the outgoing interviews of members of the team that have been here, lived it, and left?
In answer to your question, I have an oral history interview program that's focused on the senior people that leave.
Okay.
And so in essence, the interviews are transcribed with the cooperation of the Staff Judge Advocate's Office, and a copy of the interview goes to the U.S. Army Center of Military History. And because I'm a one-person deep history organization, I don't have the facilities of myself or even overtaxing the Staff Judge Advocate of having a really super robust program to interview more than just the senior people.
Right. Yeah, and that's why I bring up, there are technologies like StoryCorps where you can actually record and it's stored and it can be automatedly, because I think, I understand you're shorthanded, like the rest of Army Cyber is, as per your historical discussion, which was excellent. But I think to learn from it, we're missing a big slice of what's actually going on below deck, to use a Navy term, because in my 4.5 years, I've seen a lot of stuff below deck that above deck, I don't think anybody knows.
I couldn't agree with you more, and I'm well aware of that.
Yeah.
But it's just like everybody else. You get the program you choose to afford, not the one you want.
I understand.
And so that's where we are. The leadership here has been advised on how we can raise the standards up if we want to put the resources in to uplift in our history program to safeguard that we do a better job of capturing the history of this organization.
Right.
Yeah, so I've seen some of the transcripts of those interviews, and they're actually
Pretty good?
Pretty good, eye-opening.
Oh, okay.
To see some of the, perhaps in some cases, too candid
Oh.
responses of some of the individuals and what their thinking was at the time, at least as they are willing to say it now, what they were thinking back then. But I guess one of the things I find interesting in this whole example or in organizational design is that in 2010, through Decision Point 141, you had the Chief of Staff of the Army and the Undersecretary of the Army order certain things to happen. None of that happened. And there's no good documentation of why, other than to say that, well, politics within the service sort of came to the...
What I can say, and a number of people that I've interviewed, is the dynamic of the change of key personalities plays a significant role in how our history is shaped. And so the Chief of Staff of the Army, as Mr. Bailey was saying, when he gave guidance, and in February 2010, when he went around the table, and all the key principles were there, the people I showed you in these slides earlier, and people were nodding, we're going to do this, yes, we're going to do this. And then 8 months later, it's not done. Now, some of the people cycled out, but some of the people were still there. And I think part of it has to do with the change in the personalities. So getting to the root of that, I think that's what can be called a real sticky wicket. Some of my oral history interviews with some senior leaders involved in that, I'd say to them, well, sir, what about this? And you agreed to this there. I said, I don't remember that. Well, when you're dealing with a retired general officer, if somebody doesn't remember, that's as a government historian, that's where you leave it. That's where you leave it. So if you can find the documentation, that helps. Unfortunately, much of the work done by the Army Cyberspace Task Force, it was a task force. It was temporary. When they went away, their records and documents, most of them went with them or went to the shredder. And when I came on board, I tried to reconstitute as much of that as I could find. I got a few PowerPoint presentations. That's really about all. A few emails here and there. So for my challenge of trying to document all of this, it's like a big piece of Swiss cheese. And oh, by the way, what I presented here today, that's only my knowledge of the history based on the research I've done to date with what I know. And as Mr. Bailey points out, I certainly don't know all the ins and the outs and the backstories of how and why some of this was done. And typically, people after the recording device on an official interview is turned off, then they say, well, you want to know what really happened? And that's off the record. So it's a challenge. It's a challenge, but one I'm welcome to work on to raise the bar to get the standards higher. I may never get it all right, but at least we'll get it closer to what it was.
So I think we have approximately 5 minutes left. So is there any other thing we want to discuss with that last 5 minutes?
Well, the one thing I would say in closing that everybody really has to keep in mind, that the driving force behind the precipitous putting together of talent and briefings and like to make this place happen, from February to October 2010 was just 8 months. The Army's processes and procedures were never, ever designed to stand up a major command in such a short amount of time. So as the saying goes, you get what you pay for. They did a superb job of what they could do with what they had, but the driving force was is they didn't have a negotiable timeline to keep moving to the right. They couldn't. They had to stand it up.
Well, you know what? I'd say, given circumstances, if you look and see where we are with the build today, I think we did a pretty good job, given the limited resources and I would say some of the lack of policy, process, and procedures. All we can do is continue to refine and make the best of what we have.
Well, that's really
move
the
forward
key.
to an
It's a
ASCC.
starting point, and it created a command that was dysfunctional, and
Right.
it was dispersed, and it wasn't structured properly. It didn't have funding to do things, but it was in place to grow and build as it went and improve. And that's where we are. And so the legacy of what the people in the first few years that the commander got to leave for the latter people, that's a success story.
Yeah.
As the people on the front end, some of them are a little disgruntled and probably not as happy as they could have been, saying, "Boy, what did I sign up for to get in here?"
Learn through attempts and
Oh.
failures.
Are we gonna turn the microphone off?
So if you don't have any other comments
Because
or
success is.
I think that will conclude our.
All right, well, I'd like
No,
everybody
it's
give Dr. Kaplan a hand for moderating that first forum. Thank you, Doctor.